He bought his insurance in a small city far from any launch site, signed the papers without thinking too much about it, and only later wondered whether a policy written on Earth would still matter on the moon, where mistakes could not be repaired, and questions often arrived too late. The offer had not even been made yet, but the interview was already ending, and his careful explanation about being a middleman did not land the way he hoped it would. He explained that he had spent his entire life trying not to stand out, keeping his grades, his appearance, and even his exam results deliberately average, so he could disappear into a crowd without being noticed. The panel cut him off before he could finish, informing him that all engineering roles were filled and asking whether he would consider maintenance instead. He said yes, not because it was what he wanted, but because saying no would have meant leaving, and he had already come too far to turn back. That was how he became a maintenance worker for the United Nations Moonshield Project, a program built on the idea that the moon itself could be used as a final line of defense against extinction. Years earlier, astronomers had identified an asteroid drifting near Mars' orbit, slowly breaking free after millennia of gravitational pull, and calculations showed that in 8 years it would collide with Earth with enough force to end human civilization. The numbers were precise and unforgiving, and when the news spread, daily life collapsed into panic. Underground shelters were rushed into construction, luxury projects were demolished to make room for bunkers, and experts were asked absurd questions about who might die first if the end came. The only honest answer was that everyone would die. Faced with that certainty, the United Nations approved a plan that sounded impossible until it was already underway. The moon would be reinforced, its infrastructure expanded, and a weapon powered by helium-3 would be built to destroy the asteroid before impact. Debris would then be pulled into lunar orbit, turning the moon into a shield rather than a silent witness. It took 8 years to execute, and by the time the cosmic striking hammer was launched, the crisis appeared to be over. Humanity celebrated quietly, exhausted rather than joyful, convinced that survival had been secured at the last possible moment. For the maintenance worker, survival brought a smaller, more personal urgency. After 8 years on the project, he was preparing to return to Earth, rehearsing words he had never managed to say to the woman he had crossed paths with again and again during that time. He planned to give her 2 small figurines, a simple gesture that carried the weight of years of hesitation. Before he could act, alarms interrupted everything. A solar storm knocked one of the striking hammers off course, asteroid debris slipped free, and calculations showed that fragments would strike the moon within minutes. Evacuation orders spread across the base, countdowns replaced conversations, and spacecraft began launching one by one. In the confusion, departments were rushed, seats were filled, and checklists were cleared with mechanical efficiency. The maintenance crew was told to board a specific spacecraft, and the engines ignited before anyone noticed the empty seat left behind. By the time he realized what had happened, communication was breaking down, and debris was already entering lunar orbit. He shouted into every channel he could access, giving his name, his ID, his position relative to the base entrance, but the launch sequence continued without pause. When the final spacecraft lifted off, the moon fell silent around him. Days passed, then weeks, and he learned the full scope of what had gone wrong, The Moon Shield project had failed, the debris had not been fully contained, and Earth had been devastated by impacts and environmental collapse. Against every reasonable expectation, the base's life support systems were still functioning, stocked with enough food for hundreds of people. Alone, he calculated that he could survive for the rest of his life if he rationed carefully, and in a grim way, staying alive became an act of responsibility rather than hope. As he recorded messages into the void, he listed one piece of good news and 3 pieces of bad news, understanding that being alive could feel like both a miracle and a punishment. While Earth struggled underground with darkness, shortages, and despair, his existence on the Moon was discovered, not as a person, but as an image transmitted through damaged systems. Leaders saw an opportunity where they could no longer offer solutions. If people could watch someone endure total isolation and keep moving forward, perhaps they would find a reason to do the same. Without his knowledge, his life became a broadcast, his actions reframed into a story of sacrifice and courage that he had never intended to perform. He was still just a maintenance worker, trying to fix doors, cook meals, and survive another day, unaware that millions of people were beginning to watch him as if he were something much more than that. Life on the Moon settled into a rhythm that felt steady only because nothing changed, and every task became a way to mark time rather than improve it. As he repaired broken panels, cleaned empty corridors, and spoke to himself so his own voice would not disappear. He counted meals, tracked oxygen levels, and learned how silence could grow heavy enough to feel physical, pressing against him until even small noises sounded intrusive. When he cried, the sound went nowhere, and when he laughed at his own jokes, it felt like a strange performance staged for an audience that did not exist. He told himself that staying alive was no longer about hope or rescue, but about duty, because as long as one human remained alive, humanity itself was not entirely gone. On Earth, however, images from the Moon were being watched closely, cut together, narrated, and reshaped into something more deliberate. His isolation was presented as resolve, his routine as discipline, and his loneliness as quiet strength. The decision was made to turn him into a symbol, not because he asked for it, but because people below the surface needed someone to look at who was still standing under an open sky. Electricity flickered, air quality worsened, and entire cities disappeared beneath ash and water, while screens underground showed a man sweeping lunar dust from a floor that no longer mattered. The contrast worked. People began to talk about him as if he were a hero, even though he still saw himself as someone who had simply been forgotten. The transformation accelerated when the broadcast was formalized, announced to the public as a live window into survival beyond Earth. Details were adjusted to make the story cleaner, braver, and easier to follow. And when technical limits prevented his voice from reaching Earth, someone else spoke for him. Words he never said were placed over his actions, turning ordinary movements into speeches about hope and purpose. At first, the performance felt harmless, but cracks appeared quickly when reality refused to follow the script. He struggled with food preparation, failed experiments, and moments of despair that did not fit the image being sold. And when a red kangaroo left behind during the evacuation disrupted his carefully ordered space, the illusion of control collapsed entirely. The animal was aggressive, unpredictable, and completely uninterested in symbolism, tearing through supplies and forcing confrontations that looked absurd when framed as heroic struggle. Attempts to manage the situation only made it worse, and what Earth saw as comic relief was, for him, a reminder that survival was messy and rarely dignified. He was injured, exhausted, and furious, while commentary tried to explain his actions in ways that sounded confident but were wrong. The distance between who he was and who he was portrayed as widened until neither version felt entirely real. Despite that, something unexpected happened as days turned into weeks. People on Earth did not turn away when the image broke down. They watched him fail, argue with the kangaroo, retreat into silence, and keep going anyway. His lack of polish became the point. Underground, families began timing their meals to his routine. Children asked about the moon as if it were a place someone they knew lived, and workers returning from dangerous shifts looked up at screens to see a man who was just as tired as they were. He did not know it yet, but his ordinariness was doing more than any speech could have. The turning point came when the possibility of escape emerged, not as a promise, but as a problem. Old records revealed the existence of a long-abandoned spacecraft from a past mission, still resting somewhere on the lunar surface. If it could be repaired, if parts could be adapted, and if power constraints could be overcome, there was a theoretical path back to Earth. Calculations showed that the odds were poor, the risks extreme, and the margin for error almost non-existent. From a distance, experts debated feasibility, while he stood alone on the moon, staring at a horizon that had never offered him choices before. For the first time since being left behind, survival was no longer just about waiting, and the decision to act would force him to become something he had spent his entire life trying not to be. The plan began as a collection of numbers and distances that did not care whether he believed in them, because the moon rewarded only precision and punished hesitation without emotion. The abandoned spacecraft was real, but its condition was uncertain, its engine outdated, and its weight limits brutally strict. Every calculation showed that even if he reached it, survival would depend on decisions made without backup or rescue. He studied old mission logs, learned systems that were never meant to be touched again, and stripped usable parts from the base with the careful focus of someone who knew that mistakes could not be corrected. Each repair took longer than expected, not because he lacked skill, but because nothing was designed to be fixed by a single person working in silence. On Earth, experts argued about whether it was worth continuing to watch. The broadcast had begun as a morale tool, but now it showed exhaustion, frustration, and risk that could not be softened without lying outright. Some wanted to end it quietly before failure became public, while others insisted that turning away now would undo everything it had achieved. In the end, the decision was made for them, because viewers refused to stop watching. The idea that an average maintenance worker might attempt something this dangerous resonated more deeply than a flawless plan ever could. He was not the strongest or smartest person alive, but he was the one who was still there, and that was enough. The journey across the lunar surface was not heroic in the way stories prefer. It was long, repetitive, and physically draining, defined by strict energy limits and the slow movement of sunlight across the moon. One lunar day stretched across weeks on Earth, and by carefully chasing the sun's movement, he found a way to extend usable daylight beyond what should have been possible. It required driving in the opposite direction of his destination at first, a choice that looked like failure until the logic became clear. By matching the speed of the moon's rotation, he turned time itself into a resource, trading distance for survival. The plan worked on paper, but paper had never experienced low oxygen warnings or failing batteries. As days blurred together, the kangaroo became an unwilling companion in the journey, creating problems that logic could not solve. Supplies were damaged, tools were stolen, and at critical moments, the animal's presence forced choices that had no clean outcome. When it fell behind during the return trip, calculations showed that stopping would doom them both. Every model said to keep moving, to prioritize the mission, and leave the rest behind, because numbers do not account for attachment or guilt. He argued with himself out loud, listing reasons that sounded convincing until they collapsed under the weight of what it would mean to abandon the only living thing that had shared his isolation. When he turned the vehicle around, it was not because the plan allowed it, but because continuing forward suddenly felt impossible. The return pushed every limit at once. Power reserves dropped faster than predicted. Rest became optional. And the margin between success and failure narrowed until it felt imaginary. On Earth, analysts watched timelines slip and recalculated outcomes they no longer believed in, while underground shelters filled with people holding their breath without realizing they were doing it. The broadcast no longer needed narration, because silence said enough. When assistance arrived in the form of an autonomous lunar unit carrying a backup power source, the timing was so precise that it felt unreal, as if chance itself had chosen a side. With that final boost, the vehicle crossed the last stretch toward the base, arriving with almost nothing left to give. He reached the base alive, but survival did not bring relief, only the next decision. The damaged spacecraft could be made functional, but returning to Earth would require using the remaining weapon system as part of the launch. The same device built to save humanity would have to be carried along, altering mass, balance, and risk in ways no one could fully predict. The path home was open, but it was no longer just about him, because calculations showed that another fragment of the original asteroid still threatened Earth. For the first time since he had been left behind, the role others had assigned him aligned with reality. He was no longer invisible, and the choice in front of him would determine whether coming home was even possible at all.